Okay, let's turn now to the study in Romans chapter 14. This is feasts and fasts and food. Oh my. And we're in the conclusion section. And we left off last week in the conclusion section of, remember, we're basically in Romans chapter 14, verse 1. And we're spending this incredibly lengthy amount of time talking about the background behind not just this chapter, but we're spending the time to gain the background behind the book as a whole, the letter as a whole, to kind of see if we can launch from that context into the chapters themselves. And I promise, once we finish laying the groundwork to the context, then it'll be easier to build on top of that. But just like anything that you build, it takes a while to lay the groundwork and the framework. It takes a lot longer. Like if you're building a building, I'm thinking, then you pour the foundation and you got to let that sit and dry and firm up. And before you start building the building, you can't build too hastily. The foundation has to be firm, just like the root system of a tree. It takes a while for that roots to grow down, to grow strong, to get firm enough to hold a tree that grows tall. So that's what we're doing. We're taking our time to build the foundation, which is the context. We left off last week in this paragraph of Jews and Gentiles who embrace a Torah-respectful and Torah-observant lifestyle. So let me just read that real quick to segue into tonight's study to gain the context. So we're just right here. Same thing I read last week, okay? You ready? Here we go. Jews and Gentiles who embrace a Torah-respectful and Torah-observant lifestyle, all the while we're retaining their conviction that Yeshua is the exclusive means of salvation and ongoing sanctification in their lives, feel that Paul would not have to characterize Torah-pursuant people as weak merely due to their preferences and convictions for keeping a Torah-based lifestyle. And this, of course, includes people such as myself. I don't think Paul taught a law-free gospel, and I think it's insulting to Paul to actually suppose that he did teach a law-free gospel. And how this bears relevance to our Romans 14 context is that if we interpret Romans 14 along the traditional standard Christian interpretive perspective, that the weak in faith of Romans 14 are actually Christians who are weak in their faith towards their belief that they don't have to keep Torah, so their weakness actually compels them to continue keeping Torah. This normally fits Messianic Jews in Paul's day, in the standard interpretation that I'm borrowing. This normally fits the description of Jews who say were raised with Torah their whole life, say from in the first century, and then they come to faith in Jesus as the Messiah, but they have a hard time letting go of that lifestyle of Torah keeping. Thus, as they're joining Messianic congregations or Christian communities or church home groups or whatever you want to call that, then if they're still wanting to keep Torah, well, then these Gentile Christians who were not raised with any background of Torah but yet believe in Jesus, these Christian Gentiles would likely or have an opportunity to perhaps question why these Jewish believers want to still keep Torah. I mean, after all, Jesus set us free from all that, right? The law is somewhat a different dispensation. It's an old era. You know, things are progressing now in God's program, and we need to leave the old behind and press on towards the new. Paul is going to tell us, I'm speaking as a Gentile Christian in Paul's day, under the interpretation of standard Christianity today. Paul's going to tell us that we don't have to keep Torah, that we're free from the law, we're not under the law, and the works of the law can't save us, and things like that. And it's not the law of Moshe, but it's the law of Christ that we need to worry about, that we need to focus on. So weakness in the traditional Christian interpretation is tied to a preference for keeping Torah as a believer. That's their interpretation. But that whole interpretation feeds into the idea of a law-free gospel for Paul, and I disagree with that from a contextual perspective. I go on to say, instead, the fact that Jewish people living in and among the various first-century Christ-believing communities in Rome would have had ample opportunity to hear about Yeshua as the Messiah of their Tanakh and begin to explore his role as their personal Savior seems highly plausible from an historic point of view. So, Jewish people in Paul's day, raised with Torah, raised to have faith in God and loyalty to Torah, but not yet faith in Messiah, they would hear about Yeshua, the Messiah, as they interacted with Messianic Jews and with Christians or Gentiles who were coming into this faith movement known as Christianity and things like that. So I think that we need to do our historical research before we start just assuming that Paul was teaching a law-free gospel and that he was teaching Jews and Gentiles to forsake Torah and to just push forward to a different program. Let's continue. And that these non-Christian Jews should yet be counted as having genuine faith in the God of Israel while contemplating Yeshua's role as Messiah is all the more reasonable to assume, given the truth that Gentiles with faith in Yeshua as Messiah are in fact joined to the commonwealth of Israel at the remnant level, and thus are also shown to profess genuine faith in the God of Israel. So what I described last week is that in Paul's day, there was this larger community of faith known as the household of God or the community of Israel or something to that effect. We can read about this terminology in the book of Ephesians chapter 2, where he talks about how the Gentiles are brought into this fellow heirs, fellow covenant community with the household of God, and things like that. They're brought into proximity of the existing believers, the saints, and things like that. And the language that Paul is using, I believe, which is coupled with Romans 11, the theology behind that whole idea is that in Paul's mind, there was a larger community of faith, and this faith was made up of faith in the God of Israel and loyalty to Torah, and faith in the monotheistic, one true God, creator of the world and savior of Israel. That was Paul's faith community that he was raised with from a child. And that was the faith of Israel. Even if it wasn't in every member of Israel, understandably, nevertheless, it was the community of faith that Paul belonged to before he came to faith in Messiah. When he came to faith in Messiah, rather than leaving his community of faith, he simply refined and honed his faith in God and loyalty to Torah to now include the Messiah, Yeshua, within that fullness of faith. So his faith blossomed. He didn't abandon his faith in God. He didn't abandon his loyalty to Torah, and he certainly also didn't abandon his connection to the greater national Israel as a community of faith. And the proof is, as we read in Paul's own words and his admission, and say, as we can read in the book of Acts, that he did nothing to offend his own fellow national Israelites, nothing that was worthy of the punishment that he was receiving. He was still faithful to Torah, even faithful to the traditions of the elders. And in other letters, he admits to, and you can see this on the screen here as I'm flashing the verses here in the post-production that I put up, he admits to submitting to the punishment of the Sanhedrin and the punishments of the synagogues, several times. If he was not yet still connected to this community of faith, then why would he submit to their punishments and their own measures of discipline, right? If you were not connected to a community, then why would you submit to that? But Paul, wishing to convey this idea that he's still connected to them, did so. And I believe that's the context that helps us understand that who Paul's describing in Romans 14 are not weak in faith Jews and Gentiles who believe in Jesus but are still holding on to Torah as their weakness. Instead, weak in faith quite plainly means what it says, weak in a faith aspect, faith not in God, but weak in their faith in Messiah. So in plain language, according to Mark Nanos and the position that I understand, weak is described not as faith in Messiah. Weak is not described as faith in Messiah plus keeping Torah, but instead weak is described as a weakness towards believing that Jesus is the Messiah. And let's read about this. Let's pick up the commentary this week right here. And it reads, and these are my own words, we're still within the conclusion. At this point in my research into the identity of the weak and the strong, I can confidently say that while agreeing with the central tenet of Stern's perspective that the weak cannot in all probability be Messianic Jews still leading a Torah-submissive lifestyle after coming to faith in Yeshua HaMashiach, right, viz. Their walk of faith as Torah-keeping covenant members, has no biblical basis to be regarded by their Gentile Christian counterparts as weak. I'll go back and explain that in a moment. Nevertheless, my own personal interpretation of the identity of the weak and the strong is most closely aligned with the opinions of Yashanet and Haig, where the weak are, listen up, most likely Jewish members of the faith community who are still in decision mode as to whether or not Yeshua is the long-awaited Messiah promised in the Tanakh. So, Dr. David Stern, the author of the Complete Jewish Bible and the Jewish New Testament commentary that most of you are familiar with, you can see on my screen right now, I've got a picture of Dr. Stern and his books. He is a Messianic Jew living in Israel, and he purports that the weak in faith, he has a different take on who they are from my perspective, but he agrees, he and I are in agreement when it comes to the near impossibility of the standard Christian interpretation that the weak in faith are still Messianic Jews retaining a loyalty to Torah. And Stern agrees with me, or I agree with Stern, because he came first, that the high improbability of the weak in faith in Romans 14 being Messianic Jews still holding on to Torah, even as believers in Jesus, the high improbability is based on the fact that the entire scope of and corpus of the Tanakh leads national Israel towards faith in God and loyalty to Torah, with a view towards faith in the Messiah who would show up historically one day. So that once Messiah hits the scene, national Israel simply needs to complete the picture, not abandon the previous elements of the picture, such as loyalty to God and faith in God and loyalty to Torah. I go on to say in my commentary, in Hegg's own words, the non-Christian Jewish person's faith was genuine. So let me just stop and elaborate. The person in Paul's day who didn't yet believe in Jesus did have a genuine faith in God, although it was not a complete faith. It was genuine, but it wasn't full. It wasn't complete. It wasn't. It had not yet taken on the faith of Messiah aspect. So it had not yet reached its fullness. It had not yet reached its zenith. But it was going there. Is heading in that direction. So the non-Christian Jewish person's faith was genuine because they believed that the Messiah promised by the prophets would effect atonement for their sin. So the non-believing Jew in Paul's day was looking through the scriptures with faith in God, with loyalty towards his Torah, and with an anticipation and an interest in researching in the Messiah who is to come. These would have been interested Messianic Jew, or interested non-Christian Jews who were searching for the Messiah found in the Tanakh, right? So they're on their journey, and they're being led along by the Spirit towards the teacher of righteousness that we read about in the book of Galatians. So Hegg continues, what remained was for them, these non-Christian Jews in Paul's day, to be convinced regarding Yeshua, right? So we have faith in God plus loyalty to Torah. We have those two ingredients first, which are great. They're both genuine and they're both heartfelt. But in God's program, he knows that that's not the fullness of the picture that he's wanting them to understand. Faith in God, faith in himself, that's great. Loyalty to his laws, wonderful. But from God's program, progressively speaking, God designed the whole scope of salvation history with faith in God and loyalty to Torah for Israel to point towards an intended goal, right? To lead the national Israelite down a selected path that God selected and designed into the lap of Messiah Yeshua. And so, as Tim Hegg remarks here, what remained was for them to be convinced regarding Yeshua and to confess him as their Messiah. So we have to start with faith in God and loyalty to Torah, which leads you to understanding who Messiah Yeshua is. Thus, Hegg says, even though, or thus as I say, no, this is still Hegg. Thus, even though their faith may have been considered weak, that is, weak in regards to Messiah, right? They were still to be received as genuine covenant members by the synagogue community of the way. All right. At about 43 minutes into the study, that'll do it for the Romans 14 commentary. We'll pick this up next week and keep reading down through the conclusion. And then we're going to start turning to the verses in Romans chapter 14 and just look at each verse and comment on them. And that part of my commentary will be slightly different because, as you can see, there aren't as many notes. I might fill in some notes here, but I'm going to try and keep it slim to give it more of that unplugged feel, okay? But for now, we have to work our way down through this lengthy introduction section, okay?